Chapter 1. The First Question. Photography has something to do with resurrection. Roland Barthes, Camera Lucida. In the spring of 2021, Bruce Springsteen invited me to spend some time with him in Colts Neck, New Jersey, so that we could talk about Nebraska. When I arrived, he walked out to my car to meet me. When it was all over, he walked me back out. Everything was hand-delivered. I was wishing I'd parked 3 miles away. I'd grown up listening to the guy's records. I had a lot of questions, not all of which he should have to bother with. Springsteen has lived with the joy and burden of people wanting his time. The intimacy of the music brings something out in people. He's probably had to scrape off hundreds of us just to stay on schedule. But that day, I was his guest, and he was as good a host as I could ask for. He got me water to drink and then asked if I needed more. Later in the afternoon, he wondered if coffee was a good idea. I was at the family house and, as I think we both understood, his responsibility. Any mess I made, he'd have to clean up. I wanted to know where Nebraska came from, what it led to. It sat between two of Springsteen's most celebrated recordings in its own quiet and turmoil. He described it to me as an accident start to finish, but also as the album that still might be his best. The recording came from a place and a time in which Springsteen was facing troubles in his life, troubles that had no name as of yet. Wordsworth defines poetry as the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings, recollected in tranquility. Quite differently, Nebraska came from the middle of that overflow, was not a thing recollected in tranquility. It came from the heart of trouble and led to still more, its stark character, the lasting reward. Nebraska was unfinished, imperfect, delivered into a world hovering at the threshold of the digital, when technology would allow recorded music to hang itself on perfect time, carry perfect pitch, but also risk losing its connection to the unfixed and unfixable. Springsteen's manager, John Landau, recalled for me over several afternoons at his Westchester home the way in which Nebraska arrived. Chuck Plotkin, among Springsteen's producers and a key player in the last stages of Nebraska's creation, would talk about the anxious labor of trying to make the album conform to industry standards. But Springsteen knew the most by far, because it came from his bedroom. While we talked that day in Colts Neck, Patty Scialfa was recording next door. There were a few others around, but everyone left us alone. Patty was in the process of turning a song into a recording. For all the talk of the hours, the sweat, and the persistence involved in making records, it's worth remembering that the process is also among the highest forms of pleasure, particularly when you're watching your own song or one you love turn into the recording you feel it's meant to be, and it happens without complication. Any song could become 1,000 different records, but sometimes the recording studio is a place of pure lightness because a song is becoming just the recording it should be. That afternoon in Colts Neck, you got the sense that things were going well in the studio next door. But I was with Springsteen in another room, doing something very different. On one level, I was probing, asking about a time in his life that wasn't easy. Given the way Springsteen is interviewed throughout his career, it shouldn't have come as a surprise that he seemed to hold back nothing. Where he had no answer or question of his own, he didn't pretend all-knowingness. Some combination of an investment into truth and what seemed genuine wonder made him an unguarded collaborator. I've been out to the Colts Neck house once before, on that occasion in my capacity as a consulting producer on the documentary 20 Feet from Stardom. The director, Morgan Neville, was conducting the interview that day and had a few pages of good questions. But I always remembered that Springsteen passed on the first of those questions, which surprised me. As a question, it was a good opener, appropriate, well-delivered. But Springsteen responded by saying something along the lines of, "What else you got?" Whether it was intended to or not, that response shifted the energy in the room. Frankly, I'd never seen an interview start like that. What else you got? The room belonged to Springsteen from that point forward. On the second question, he took a room of filmmakers who were slightly off axis to another place. He pictured the singers on Phil Spector recordings, including his friend Darlene Love, who helped us hear and consider the youth in their voices. He'd obviously thought deeply about backup singers, the film's subject, and about the emotional layer those voices added to so many great recordings. This was a storyteller at work, not a Q&A session. One story he told that day in Colts Neck revolved around his trip by Greyhound to a David Bowie session in Philadelphia, where Bowie was cutting two of Springsteen's songs. Bruce Springsteen was nobody at that point, just a weird name that suggested anything but what was coming. Luther Vandross, a key figure in 20 Feet from Stardom, was at those same Bowie sessions, singing and arranging backups on Bowie's Young Americans. The documentary's early edit already included some clips from that very session, with Luther Vandross leading the small vocal combo that added so much to Young Americans. No one would have known that Bruce Springsteen lurked in the shadows, watching it go down. Pure coincidence. That is, no one knew Springsteen was there that day until he told the story at his Colts Neck home. 20 Feet from Stardom was given a fresh edit just after that interview. From that point forward, the film opened with Springsteen. He was that good. But I'll tell you this, the experience made me consider at some length the first question I planned to ask during my Nebraska interview on my second visit to Colts Neck. I just didn't want to hear him say, "What else you got?" I wasn't sure I had the backbone to hear that and still be ready for the next question. So I developed a foolproof method to avoid such a moment. Make it a yes or no question. Warren Zanes, are there any photographs of the room where you recorded Nebraska? Springsteen, no. He'd answered my first question, but we arrived at the second question pretty damn fast. Fortunately, I had another one ready to go. But what of the first? I wanted to see that room because something important was made there, and I wanted to know if by looking at a photograph of the space, I could see traces of what happened, the outlines of Nebraska. And maybe those photographic traces could bring it back to life for me, a resurrection. Photographs of his previous place, the Homedale farmhouse, are easy to find online. Whether you see Springsteen in them or not, whether the amps and guitars are in the rooms or not, you look at them knowing who was there once and what got done at the time. Darkness on the edge of town and much of the river. The rooms begin to breathe. Apparently, even Bob Dylan had made his own attempt to see one of Springsteen's creative spaces, empty and well after the fact. There was a rainy night in Long Branch, New Jersey, 2009, when police picked up Dylan in a neighborhood close to where Springsteen wrote most, if not all, of the Born to Run album. Some quick, if speculative, reporting captured the incident. The police had approached Dylan when the future Nobel Prize winner was on the grounds of a home up for sale, apparently investigating the property. The proximity to Springsteen's former rental, coupled with Dylan's somewhat recent visits to Neil Young's and John Lennon's childhood homes, gave interested journalists a basis from which to work. The Guardian reported it this way. Probing musicians' backgrounds who influenced the world of rock in the 1960s and 1970s is a hobby for Dylan. Last November, he turned up unannounced at a Winnipeg house where the Canadian rock star Neil Young grew up. Kiernan and Patty Regan came home from shopping to find him waiting on their doorstep and invited him in. Then in London, Dylan paid a £16 entrance fee and mingled anonymously with tourists at the childhood home of John Lennon in Wootton, Liverpool. Finally, last month, homeowners in Long Branch, 30 miles south of New York, phoned the authorities when they noticed a scruffy figure ambling along a residential street and entering the yard of an up-for-sale house. Soaking wet, Dylan, 68, gave his name to Christy Buble, a 24-year-old police officer, and informed her that he was in town to headline a concert with country star Willie Nelson and rocker John Mellencamp. She was skeptical. Dylan was, it seems, just behaving like, say, a Melville reader given the chance to peer into the modest Berkshire's room where the author wrote Moby Dick, or a Hitchcock fan presented with the opportunity to inspect the room where the director collaborated on Vertigo storyboards. Something vast that couldn't fit in such spaces came from them nonetheless. Surely that's worth a look. Springsteen's Long Branch rental was, at some point in the 1970s, filled with characters. Jersey Shore dumps, confessions, lies, dreams, rusted-out cars, love. And Springsteen put it all in an order that he called Born to Run. You couldn't look at that rental and see all of that then, and you can't see it now. but we know what happened there, so we see differently with our imaginations as much as our eyes. Nebraska came from a bedroom in Colts Neck, another rental, this time a ranch house. My first question in the interview was just an attempt to go by the place, to look at it with Springsteen. The imagery of Nebraska, the electric chairs, the batons, the radio towers, the tail lights, the people in their quiet desperation, they all passed through that room. But as Springsteen told me, no photographs exist. So I moved on to my second question. Why Nebraska? Why right then? To which he replied, it was a strange moment. I came off the river tour and I felt that hollowness. Part of it was just my time. I was 32, 33. I was living literally 5 minutes up the road from here. It was right before my first big crash, my depressive crash, that I had in 1982. This was just before that, and there was a lot of strange stuff in the air. In my life, I guess. In the absence of photographs, Springsteen gave me in words what I was going to need in order to get into that room. So that's how we spent the afternoon, driving by a place that was no longer there, that only he could see. Chapter 2, The Golden Age of Bands. So then I went over to Paul's and knocked on his door. I said the same thing. I'm leaving the band. I feel you three guys are really close and I'm out of it. And Paul said, I thought it was you three. Ringo Starr, the Beatles anthology. It used to be that students were expected to make their own book covers to protect school property textbooks. Brown paper bags, cut, fitted, and taped in place, often served such a purpose. The covers could be customized, scrawled with boyfriends' and girlfriends' names, Aerosmith lyrics, abstract patterns expressing a total lack of interest in classrooms, stickers from wacky packages, scribbled tirades. I remember when my brother decorated his math and history book cover with images of Bruce Springsteen, taken from the covers of Time and Newsweek. This happened in Concord, New Hampshire, fall 1975. At that time, and in that place, Bruce Springsteen was as foreign to my brother's classmates as was Bob Marley. That was going to change in both cases, but my brother was out in front of things for the time being. We watched as the Springsteen phenomenon grew and grew, until Led Zeppelin no longer provided the soundtrack for parking lot activities outside the Concord High School football field. New Hampshire was a backwater, often among the last places to embrace whatever was coming next. From the wild, the innocent, and these streets shuffle forward, we were watching the artist's moves, waiting for the recordings, checking in at Pitchfork Records on Main Street, and getting the latest releases as soon as they were available. Every album seemed like a part of some meaningful progression. Springsteen was an index of where things were at, and more important, where they might be headed. Once my brother and I were playing in the Del Fuegos, doing gigs in Boston and then New York, we'd meet other musicians who had watched Springsteen in the way we had. Scott Kempner was one of them. He'd been in the Dictators, then formed the Del Lords. Our band would join the latter on a Folk City bill that also featured the New York City debut of The Replacements. There were several people there that night who had spent long hours listening to Bruce Springsteen records, looking at album jackets, thinking about the factory girls underneath the boardwalk where they all promised to unsnap their jeans. There wasn't a lot of rock and roll on the charts that also mattered to musicians in the early 1980s underground bands. Springsteen was an exception. He hadn't cut the cords that connected him to the bars and one-bedroom apartments we knew so well. So we all watched him as if he were one of us. Because Scott Kempner was a little older than we were, though, he was one musician on the Folk City bill who had a perspective on Springsteen that exceeded our own. He actually knew the guy. That was something. When Nebraska came out, Kempner was telling everyone, you have to hear this record. He believed Nebraska was special. When Los Angeles' Blasters came into town for a gig, Dave Alvin, the group's songwriter and guitar player, slept on Scott Kempner's couch. This was how the system worked, if it could be called a system. I was staying at Scott's, and it's all they were talking about, Nebraska, Alvin recalls. So I picked it up once we got back home, and I understood. There were bands across the country thinking about Nebraska, telling one another they had to listen. Springsteen was known as a band leader, but this recording wasn't a band thing. So what did it mean? Since the time of the early Beatles, rock and roll groups were the locus of identity for many young American males. For those who went after it, to be in a band was to be. People struggled to get into them. I knew why, if only because I experienced it from the inside. When my brother brought me into the Del Fuegos, a lot of things made sense, and right away, I belonged. And when I quit, not talking to him for 2 years after some brutal exchanges, I didn't belong. You were in or you were out. I found that people were often less vocal about the patience and fortitude required to stay in a band. Bands could break your heart. Springsteen spoke plainly about this the day I visited, about how his own group managed to keep being a band and over a period of decades. It took a lot of sorting out over the years, he told me. There's a lot of displacement of emotion and enmeshment that occurs with your band that is not necessarily good for either the band or yourself. So yeah, we've lasted a long time, amazingly enough, but there's been a psychological progression in the band itself that has allowed us to remain as connected as we are today. Otherwise, we'd have broken up like most bands do. But with Nebraska, Springsteen had figured out the crucial, if counterintuitive truth. One of the ways to keep the band together, to stay connected, was to disconnect. Nebraska was an example of that in practice. Bands break up because they can't make that psychological progression, Springsteen went on to say. They don't have the skills or ability. So if you're going to stay together, you have to make that progression, unless you're just doing it for economic reasons. We're one of the few bands who really made that leap of consciousness into another state of development that kept us creatively vital and also simply together. Nebraska defined that I was going to have a work life that involved working with the band and sometimes not working with the band. This was the first record that laid that out. No one knew right then, in 1982, that the golden age of bands was like other golden ages, bound to end. There may always be pockets of band activity, new iterations driven by new technologies and new ripples from the margins, even movements like grunge or indie rock. But the day a concert and club bills made up almost entirely of bands would come to a close. The late Adam Schlesinger of Fountains of Wayne described a period during which his band's 2003 hit Stacy's Mom put them on some dates with other charting performers. No other act, he said, was lugging a drum kit and amps onto the stage. As a four-piece combo of 2 guitars, bass, and drums, they were a curiosity. When Springsteen went from the river to Nebraska, he went from the world of the band into another experience, isolated. To some people who played in groups, it looked like freedom. To others, a concern. To some, a frontman's indulgence. If you put all your money down on that thing the Beatles and the Rolling Stones represented, this called for a moment of pause. A band guy left every trace of that tradition behind, then called it his best work. Scott Kempner, like so many others in the mid-1960s, had figured out early that playing in a rock and roll band was the best thing on offer for a young man of limited means. He didn't have to read music. He didn't have to wake up early. Girls who otherwise wouldn't notice you might just show some interest. The American dream might not hold up under close inspection, but rock and roll offered an escape route and sometimes a hint of that dream. For a kid from the Bronx, like Scott Kempner, born in 1954, the year of Elvis's first single on Sun Records, this was a way forward. You could leave home and have a different kind of family, bound by shared interests. The Beatles and the Stones were only the most visible confirmations that playing in a rock and roll band was a line of work and a way of life with considerable upsides. And those were just the 2 biggest names. There were many, many more in that parade. Kempner was 10 when the Beatles played on the Ed Sullivan Show. By the time he was a teenager, he was seeing rock and roll bands everywhere. Why work in a bank? Kempner was one among a legion of like-minded young people who heard that call. Young men, that is. However progressive the culture that emerged around rock and roll, when it came to gender, things were coded male. By 1966, there were so many kids wanting in on the band thing that music stores struggled to keep Ringo drum kits in stock. Of course, as Kempner and so many others would discover, there was one significant problem with bands. Every one of them included other members. Bruce Springsteen, 5 years older than Kempner, was another East Coast guy who started playing in groups without pausing to consider the alternatives. Later in his life, Springsteen would insist that this was so only because there were no alternatives. Both men would be in and out of groups throughout their lives, seemingly unable to stop, despite what they had learned along the way, despite the accumulation of disappointments and adjustments to the ideal. I remember when the first Bruce record came out, and he was the new Dylan, Kempner recalls. Like right off the bat, I couldn't believe that anybody had the nerve to even use that. I understand that it was the record label, the promotion department that was responsible, but I thought, I don't need to ever hear this guy. First reaction. Kempner was right that it wasn't Springsteen's idea. And Springsteen, who for years resisted the new Dylan tag and lived with it as a burden, not a blessing, was right in thinking that any promotional campaign sounding that new Dylan refrain risked alienating the very audience members who mattered the most. But in time, the records would have their way with Kempner. A year or so after hearing all that new Dylan stuff, the Dictators were standing outside this recording studio, Kempner recalls. It's like midnight before we all go our separate ways, and Andy Chernoff goes, I heard this new Springsteen album, the follow-up. I figure he's going to tell me it was a piece of shit. He says, I think you better hear it. I said, why? Andy Chernoff didn't elaborate, just told Kempner he should check it out. The Dictators and Springsteen were label mates at Columbia, so Kempner could get a free promo copy of The Wild, The Innocent, and the E Street Shuffle. He went up to Columbia the next day. I asked for a copy from the label, Kempner says, and I think it was all I listened to for like 6 months, maybe more. I couldn't believe that record. I didn't want to hear anything else. At that time, the Dictators were managed and produced by Murray Krugman and Sandy Pearlman, the team that handled Blue Oyster Cult. This meant that, among other things, Scott Kempner could get on the guest list when Blue Oyster Cult shared the bill with Rod Stewart and the Faces at Madison Square Garden. That was on February 24th, 1975. The Faces, widely considered one of the great rock and roll bands, were struggling in the shadows of their lead singer's solo career. Stewart's Maggie May alone eclipsed anything the Faces would ever release. The Faces' next U.S. tour would be their last, while that singer, Rod Stewart, would have several more costume changes coming. His disco hit, Do You Think I'm Sexy, was just 3 years off. Backstage at the Garden for the Blue Oyster Cult Faces show was a lavish affair. In Kempner's words, it was a tons of food thing. One Faces crew member described the group's touring style as being like the good old days of the Wild West in America, when Jesse James and his men would ride into town, take all the money, have all the women, and ride into the next town and do the same thing. It was like a hurricane passing through. Everyone had a drink in their hand around the clock. It also meant that catering was at times exceptional. Kemper got to the Garden and went straight for the buffet, and then it was only a matter of finding a spot at the backstage table where no one would bother him while he ate. I'm walking around, very few seats, most of the tables have like maybe one spot left, Kempner recalled. Finally, I get to this table, and there's this one guy eating there at the end with a few empty seats around him. I walk over there, and before I could say anything, I realize it's fucking Bruce Springsteen. Free food was free food, and neither of these Columbia artists had much in their refrigerators back home. Getting signed to a major label like Columbia didn't really mean a lot until you had hits, and even then it could be years before an artist experienced the material rewards associated with success. In the meantime, you got what you could of Rod Stewart's duck pate. I walk up, Kempner continued, and say, Bruce, I just wanted to tell you I've been listening to your record since I got it like months ago. He smiles, thanks me. I say, we're label mates. I'm in the Dictators. And then he stood straight up, like bolted to his feet, and said, you're in the Dictators? I saw you guys. Stevie took me to the bottom line. I couldn't believe it. I wanted to meet you, but I was too nervous. I was all of a sudden in the twilight zone. Springsteen told Kempner to sit down, and the two guys in bands talked for an hour, mostly about bands. They'd meet again within the year when Kempner was sitting in the booth of the Carnegie Hall Cinema where his girlfriend was tearing tickets. When he didn't have a gig, Kempner would keep her company. After she finished work, they'd take a bus back to the Bronx. It was winter and one of New York City's coldest nights. Kempner and his girlfriend had a space heater in the ticket booth. It was a double feature of Mean Streets and The Wild Bunch. Kempner was looking at the people in the line when he saw Springsteen, wearing only a leather jacket and backward baseball hat. He knew that Springsteen, despite having born to run in the stores by that time, would probably be grateful if Kempner's girlfriend could comp a ticket, save him the $5. He was right. A few years after that, the Dictators were in the recording studio next to the E Street Band at the record plant, and by then the two groups had a kinship. The E Street Band was working on Darkness on the Edge of Town, the Dictators on Blood Brothers. They came a few days after us, Kempner recalled. Months later, they were still there, and we were long gone. But there were only 2 rooms on the ground floor, and then there was a lounge to share. So for the 2 months we were there, we all saw each other every single day. As is often the case, more happened in the lounge than in the studios. We got to know everyone in the band, Kempner explained, especially Bruce and Clarence, which was a real revelation of the whole deal. Their relationship was so obviously special and apart from everything else, except maybe Bruce's with Stevie. But Bruce and Clarence, the two of them, could do any honeymooners top to bottom. They just had this thing. It radiated from the two of them. Clarence would sneak into our studio with us because we were potheads. He would come in the studio and smoke with us. Then he'd always go, "You guys aren't going to tell the boss, right?" We were like, "Clarence, we're not the kind of guys who tell anything on anybody ever. You can be sure we're not going to tell Bruce you're smoking pot with us." The main reason the members of the E Street Band and the members of the Dictators understood one another, however, wasn't that every one of them had some experience of street life, whether on one side of the Hudson or the other. Yes, the street gave them a common language, but what really bound them was the fact that they'd all spent their entire adult lives playing in rock and roll bands. Shifting, defining, rich in misunderstanding, glorious, sick with hidden aspirations, delicate beyond comprehension, bands were the mystery they all called home. One of the first days we were recording Blood Brothers, Bruce comes back from lunch with what looks like a poster in a poster tube, Kempner recalled. He's got a hammer. He's got one of those little clear boxes of different nails. He comes into our recording studio, takes out this poster. It's the poster of Bridget Bardot on the motorcycle, hammers it into the wall, and looks at it like he's so proud of himself, like he figures this has gotta be so up their alley, these Dictator guys. And of course it was. We were a rock and roll band. During those Springsteen sessions at the record plant, preparing to record the song Darkness on the Edge of Town, the E Street Band set up in a room that was in the process of being rebuilt. It was bare concrete walls, unfinished and not intended for recording, exactly the kind of room you were supposed to avoid when making records. It was alive to a fault, and Springsteen loved it. You couldn't mistake the sound they got for anything other than a band playing together. For Springsteen's next record, The River, he'd go even deeper into that band thing. If Born to Run was a record that sounded like a record, like a production, The River, recorded at Manhattan's Power Station, would be the record that sounded like a band, hammering away in a room, sounds ricocheting off the walls. It was an effort to capture and convey the idea that guys like Springsteen and Kempner had given their lives to, the rock and roll band. Until it stops working, to be in a band was to have an instant identity, a badge and license. The proof of belonging was those other members. And when everyone was in on it, committed and sworn in, staring down the same ambitions, nothing and no one could fuck with that. That's how it felt on the inside. That's what Springsteen was after with The River, to capture the sound inside that experience as it happened on a stage. And he did it the way he'd always done it, obsessively. Chapter 3, The Sound Inside That Thing. With Nebraska, I was writing a type of song that I probably would have been embarrassed to sit down and sing in front of the band in the studio. If I could have sung it at all, it wouldn't have been the same. If I'd gone in the studio and just introduced that music in a normal way, I don't know if Nebraska would have ever occurred. Bruce Springsteen, in Conversation with the Author, 2021. You can't get to Nebraska without going back to the river, because Nebraska was born somewhere in all that noise. Nebraska would signal changes that Springsteen would call the end of something, and that would include the first part of his life as the leader of the E Street Band. As a recording, The River was a confrontation contained on 4 sides of a double album. I wanted to cut some music, Springsteen said, that felt very explosive. As a record, it careened and contradicted itself. It was something of a wreck, and in being a wreck, restored a crucial understanding that the message and meaning of rock and roll didn't always get clearer when a recording's fidelity and organization did. The River implicitly argued that imperfection is the essential ingredient of rock and roll performance. But setting out to capture the sound of a band, a loud version of the truth that had originally promised to set young men like Bruce Springsteen and Scott Kempner free, Springsteen faced the thing itself in the earliest hours of work. No sooner than the end of the first day of recording The River, Steven Van Zandt told Springsteen he was quitting. The guitar player said he couldn't go through that E Street Band experience in the studio one more time. Van Zandt was referring to what happened with Darkness on the Edge of Town, the many months of struggle involved in finding the record Springsteen had in his mind, a process that might have been easier, of course, if Springsteen's mind didn't keep changing. Darkness on the Edge of Town had been a fight, and the first day of recording its follow-up seemed to Van Zandt a sure sign that some repetition compulsion was at work in the psyche of Bruce Springsteen. As Van Zandt recalled to Springsteen's biographer, Peter Ames Carlin, he took Springsteen aside and made his position clear. I said, "Listen, I'm sorry, but I can't do this again. You carry on, but I quit. I'm splitting." In Van Zandt's recollection, Springsteen quickly promised it would be different, which makes sense because you need a band to capture the sound of a band. And even if one of the most common sounds a band makes is "I quit," it's not a sound that can fill an album. Springsteen needed his bandmate for noises other than that. Carlin writes, Van Zandt was having none of it. The real problem, he told Bruce, was that his production team, he, Landau, and the rest of their production team didn't have a fucking idea about what they're doing. Speaking 31 years later, he reins in his critique of everyone except Bruce and his pathological work habits. They all had their talents, I knew that. But contemplating the whole fucking years it was going to take to make a record, I couldn't do that. Didn't have the patience. And that's when he said, no, I want you to produce it with me. And that's a direct quote. Van Zandt was willing to stay under those new conditions, which meant that contrary to what he told Springsteen, he could do it again if he got a producer credit. It wasn't exactly a job interview that landed him the position. It was Van Zandt as a key band member threatening to leave and a band leader managing that situation in the most expedient fashion. It's hard to imagine that Springsteen had that warm all-for-one and one-for-all feeling at the end of that particular business day, but at least he knew everyone would show up for work the next afternoon. So, starting from day 2 of recording The River, there were 3 producers on the project, Bruce Springsteen, Jon Landau, and Steven Van Zandt. And really, the negotiation that landed Van Zandt his producer credit would help get Springsteen what he wanted, a band record with a band sound. But Van Zandt was right. It was going to take an unreasonably long amount of time. Van Zandt would quit again midway through recording Born in the USA, and he'd join again after what he would later describe to Rolling Stone as 7 years of walking his dog. Of course, by the time the dog walking was done, with Van Zandt back in the group, the E Street Band wasn't the same thing it had been in 1979. It's a law of rock and roll bands that each negotiation along the lines of Van Zandt's at the beginning of the River sessions erodes the ideal form that once signaled freedom for all. The struggle and erosion are intrinsic to a band's life. The miracle is that in the case of the E Street Band, there still is a band. Though Springsteen's recording career started as one man's contract with Columbia Records and would remain one man's contract, he was still raised under the sign of the Beatles. The being in a band mattered deeply from the beginning, to Springsteen as to Van Zandt. In 1979, 1980, neither was done with it, not yet. And yes, The River would be the high point in trying to make a group sound central to the work of a man under contract as a solo artist. The mission was, on many levels, a shared mission. As a project, The River had purpose, intention, and a target, mostly. When the album was finally done, its artwork would underscore the sound of the recordings with a visual message. There are photographs of a group playing together, recording at the power station, in rehearsals, on a park bench, on a rooftop, in the street. You saw more of that band in the River artwork than in any other Springsteen album design before or after. The band leader, at times looking like Gene Vincent, was alone only on the cover of The River. The fans who bought and held the album, staring into its images to unearth its secrets, saw a guy in a band, surrounded. When they dropped the needle, they mostly heard the same thing coming from the speakers. And there was no mistaking where it was all coming from. There were no palm trees in the photographs. It was East Coast rock and roll. You got the sense that even if all the inner sleeve photographs had been in color, they still would have been black and white. In that place, the asphalt, the leather jackets, and the trees were all the same color. With the sounds bleeding together, the river felt like an embodied argument against an earlier, mid-1960s shift in emphasis that had affected most, if not all, the popular music. Since the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper's and the Beach Boys' Pet Sounds, recording studio work had been made a kind of priority, with live performance often assuming a supporting role. When Brian Wilson stopped performing with the Beach Boys, focusing instead on the group's majestic recordings, when the Beatles came off the road permanently in 1966 to focus on the studio, they made a point about what mattered. Records, the recording studio. Performances, they were typically meant to represent and promote the latest album. It wasn't the way James Brown thought about things. Brown had his mind on the show and made records along the way. Springsteen was out to restore some balance. So the river reversed the priorities. It was a project meant to capture in the studio what happened on the stage rather than vice versa. He wanted to make a record that could give listeners a taste of what happened up there during a live show, when everyone in the band responded to the same 1, 2, 3, 4. West Coast acts like the Eagles, Fleetwood Mac, and Linda Ronstadt had dominated the mid-1970s with crisp and controlled recordings, gorgeous stuff. They labored, they layered, they separated musicians into different studio spaces to avoid bleed in the microphones. On stage, those same acts attempted to realize in the live setting what they'd done in the studio. And if they had to stand stock still to do it, they would. It wasn't like an R&B review at the Apollo. That's not to suggest that great albums didn't come of it all. Ronstadt's Heart Like a Wheel is just one example of the often stunning results. But for some, the teachings of early rock and roll had been lost, and the pendulum needed to swing back in the other direction. The river would ride on top of that pendulum as if it were one part roller coaster, one part wrecking ball. Something needed tearing down, and the destruction, Springsteen believed, could be a thrill ride. The No Nukes concert of 1979, held in the middle of the River Sessions, put Springsteen and the E Street Band up against the mellow self-presentation of Crosby, Stills and Nash, Jackson Browne, the Doobie Brothers, James Taylor, and others. There, too, a point was going to be made. You don't need to sacrifice the physicality and performativity of a real rock and roll show to deliver the emotion associated with the singer-songwriter's solo trip. You could do both and kill the place. Even Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers, representing a California very different from that of the other acts at No Nukes, had to contend with the sheer force of Springsteen's show. The arena belonged to Springsteen for both of their two nights. When Petty was getting ready to take the stage in the slot before the E Street Band, a member of the stage crew urged him to make no mistakes regarding that sound coming from the audience. "Don't worry, they're not booing, they're saying Bruce." Petty looked at him, quietly replying, "Which is worse?" Then he took the stage. Nick Hornby, writing for The Guardian years later, weighed it all, thinking of Springsteen's reworking of the James Brown Cape routine and self-conscious drive to have a show on the Madison Square Garden stage. What's remarkable, looking at it now, Hornby writes, is that Springsteen's uncomplicated showbiz gestures seem way more authentic than all the smiley, gleaming teeth sincerity that James Taylor, Carly Simon, and the rest of the performers are trying to project. What, after all, could be more sincere than a performer performing and acknowledging that he's performing? No Nukes was a kind of mid-course confirmation that the direction the river was taking, "Let's get this show on record," was indeed the right one. The Madison Square Garden audiences had cast their vote. After the No Nukes performances and back at the power station, continuing work on the river, Springsteen was ever more committed to capturing on record that energy of an ensemble born to the club circuit, just as he was determined to keep some rock and roll in the arenas. Contrasting his ambitions as a record maker to those of the Southern California school and what he called its almost stultifying attention to detail, Springsteen spells out his ambition in Born to Run. "We wanted open room mics, smashing drums. The snare sound on Elvis's Hound Dog was my holy grail. Crashing cymbals, instruments bleeding into one another, and a voice sounding like it was fighting out from the middle of a brawling house party. We wanted the sound of less control. This was how many of our favorite records from the early days of rock and roll had been recorded. You mic'd the band and the room. You heard the band in the room. The sonic characteristics of the room were essential in the quality and personality of your recording. The room brought the messiness, the realness, the can't get out of each other's way togetherness of musicians in search of that sound. He described it all in the name of we, the rock and roll band pronoun of choice, the can't get out of each other's way pronoun, that we. But as a record out to capture the glory of what happened on stage with the E Street Band, the Rivers' conceptual framing didn't serve all its material equally well. In his own writing, Springsteen would say that one hope he had in making the record was to leaven the unrelenting seriousness of Darkness on the Edge of Town with something lighter that happened in front of an audience. This, it seems, was an ambition Van Zandt could help him realize. With Steve's encouragement, Springsteen writes, I began to steer the record into a raw direction. This is the album where the E Street Band hit its stride. To Peter Ames Carlin, Springsteen would say that he wanted to combine the fun aspect of what the band did along with the story I was telling. The question would be whether listeners went to recordings looking for the same things they got from live shows. Did the fun matter in the same way in both situations? Just a few years after its release, Springsteen would speak of The River as an album that pulled in different directions, sharing his own thoughts on what others saw as its exuberant but undecided quality. On The River, he told Hot Press, I'd have a song like this and a song like that because I didn't know how to combine it. After first delivering the album to Columbia as a single LP titled The Ties That Bind, Springsteen put a stop to the release. Something was troubling him already. In conversation with Robert Hilburn, when the double album was finally in stores, he explained, I had an album of 13 songs finished a year ago, September, but I didn't put the record out because it wasn't personal enough. This album seems much more personal to me. Personal, not a band word, a songwriter word, a Springsteen word. And the personal was the thing in jeopardy when the can't get out of each other's way aspect was emphasized. It's hard to get both those elements on the same recording. Springsteen had managed it before, but that didn't mean it was a simple matter. One writer, trying to describe the ultimate form the River assumed, pegged it as Les Kierkegaard, lots more Kingsman, and Bobby Fuller 4. Maybe the River still wasn't personal enough, even after the balance was addressed. The spectrum of the album's material was wide, with a song like Crush on You at one end, and something along the lines of Stolen Car at the other. Crush on You has all the immediacy of a song written moments before it was recorded, and you can hear the band having a hell of a good time putting it down, Springsteen screaming his way through a lyric that you don't need to know to understand. But no one was going to corner Springsteen and tell him that Crush on You told the story of their life. Stolen Car, quite differently, felt like a poet at work. You hear every word. The production is skeletal, built around Springsteen's strummed electric guitar and Roy Bittan's piano. Distant background vocals and drums enter partway through but remain at a distance. An organ gets its place, but only when Springsteen's vocal is complete. While songs as different as Crush on You and Stolen Car could coexist in a live show, helping to establish the rhythm of a performance, they couldn't always do that on a record. Not easily, at least. Records and live shows are indeed two different mediums, no matter the Venn diagram overlap. Springsteen would later describe Crush on You as the worst song we ever put on record, but about Stolen Car he felt differently. A song like this and a song like that. And really, it was the beginning of bigger differences between the band leader and his guitar player and co-producer, a producer like this and a producer like that. In contrast to the more meditative, story-driven existentialism of Stolen Car, Crush on You wasn't pulled from the inner life of a songwriter. It was the kind of song that happened when a band turned up the Fender amplifiers, paid little mind to the neighbors, and ignored the landlord's calls. It wasn't about introspection. It didn't stare into any abyss, walk into any solitude. But it was probably a great feeling to play it as a combo. Stolen Car, on the other hand, was the sound of a man who told stories even when he was in a room by himself, a lost one singing of lost ones. That storyteller, because he was making a particular kind of band record, brought in his group to support even the Stolen Car kinds of tales. If there was a schizophrenic quality to the river that was in some way essential to its character, it had to do with the swing between these two types of songs. No such swing would animate the river's follow-up. It would be Springsteen going in one direction without looking back, leaving everyone and everything behind. The end of something. It's this stuff that he completely ignores about himself that is, to me, his highest evolution, Steven Van Zandt would later remark. It's easy to be personal. It's easy to be original, believe it or not. Pink Floyd is easy. Louie Louie is hard. Springsteen's old friend was operating with a significantly different value system, challenging the importance of the very thing at which Springsteen excelled, the personal, while also believing that he, perhaps better than anyone, understood the songwriter Bruce Springsteen. I knew exactly what he sounded like, Van Zandt would say, exactly what the band sounded like, exactly what he heard in his head, and how he needed the next album to sound. Springsteen, a man who asked questions, had a co-producer who specialized in answers. On the best days, it worked out in a yin-yang kind of fashion, and then there were the other days. As herd animals, band members do their best work when they can think with one mind, when their shared interests bring them together in some clumsy yet glorious movement forward. Look, there's water over there, let's go get some. But when one of them wanders off by himself, looking for a thing the others don't have in mind, it's a different experience of the prairie. Gone is the oneness. The River Tour was going to be an unforgettable message about what a rock and roll band could be and could do. The energy of live performance Springsteen captured with that recording he would bring to the legendary tour that followed. Both were not just great successes, they were lasting statements about rock and roll. But the stolen car part of Springsteen, that personal part, was the heartbeat beneath the floorboards. For some, the personal approach to songwriting might seem like a choice to be made, almost a stylistic decision. For Springsteen, it would never be that. It's just who he is. I'm an alienated person by nature, Springsteen told Brian Haidt in 2010. Always have been, still am to this day. It continues to be an issue in my life, in that I'm always coming from the outside, and I'm always trying to overcome my own internal reticence and alienation, which is funny because I throw myself the opposite way on stage. But the reason I do that is because while the stage and all those people are out there, the abyss is under my heels, and I always feel it back there. The river was only partially about the back there. Nebraska would balance things out. It was all back there. Chapter 4, Suicide in the Hallways. Even my melody is reduced to next to nothing on Nebraska. Melody would have ruined it totally. It just wasn't austere enough. The austerity was much more important. Bruce Springsteen, in Conversation with the Author, 2021. The power station, where the river was recorded, is located in a former Con Edison power transfer building on Manhattan's West 53rd Street. In 1979, the neighborhood was still dirty, on the outskirts of Broadway, and close enough to Times Square to get a whiff of the booze on its breath. New York wasn't yet cleaned up for tourist traffic. After Con Edison moved out, but before Chic and the Rolling Stones would cut records there, the building was used as a soundstage for Monty Hall's Let's Make a Deal and television's gothic soap opera Dark Shadows. That weirdness was no doubt part of the studio's aura. The music chapter in the building's history began in 1977 when Tony Bongiovi redesigned the site for recording. Bongiovi had some innate gifts for sound. When just a teen in Raritan, New Jersey, he cold called Motown Records. In the course of that phone conversation, someone at Motown picked up Bongiovi's strengths and flew him to Detroit to work at their studio. Tony was that kind of kid. After opening the power station, he let his second cousin sweep the place in exchange for studio time. The demos that second cousin made led to the signing of a group called Bon Jovi, and as it happened, years of lawsuits between the relatives. That's another New Jersey story. When the E Street Band set up camp at the power station to cut the river, Springsteen often stayed at a New York hotel facing the southern side of Central Park. It was as close to being on the road as he could be without changing cities each night. The walk from the hotel to the studio was short, but Springsteen would, in the end, know it in every season. True to Steven Van Zandt's forecast, on day one of the sessions, the making of the river went far longer than was projected. After delivering that single album, The Ties That Bind, to his label, and then taking it back almost as quickly, Springsteen wrote more and more songs, eventually spending his own money to record them until there wasn't a whole lot of money left. They were at the power station for well over a year. During that time, as both the pleasure and the point of the work became less obvious, it was much as it had been back at the record plant, with other acts working down the hall, on another floor, passing through the lounge, waiting for the bathroom. However insular the big recording studios were, cut off from life outside like gated communities of creative striving and sloth in equal measures, inside they allowed contact with the other artists who were coming and going. Very few acts stayed as long as the E Street Band, but those who booked time in that period often met Springsteen and his band, all of whom were increasingly interested in people who were not in the E Street Band. Carly Simon and Diana Ross were both working at the power station in that period, the latter making a record with Nile Rodgers and Bernard Edwards of Chic. Ric Ocasek of the Cars was there producing Suicide. If you wanted to mark a point that's as far from the Eagles' Hotel California as you can get, Alan Vega and Martin Rev's Suicide might be it. Oddly enough, for the recording of their debut, Suicide had used the less illustrious 914 Studios in Blauvelt, New York, where Born to Run was recorded. But that shared experience hadn't led to any interactions between Alan Vega and Bruce Springsteen. The power station would be the place where the two men would get to know each other. It was an odd but lasting connection that would mean less to the river than it would to Nebraska. Of Nebraska, one critic would go so far as to say that without Suicide, we wouldn't have Nebraska. Carly Simon had a different experience of Suicide. In Alan Vega's recollection, Carly Simon responded to Suicide with a disgusted look, which was much more in line with what the duo was accustomed to. By most accounts, Suicide didn't make it easy to be a fan, so they didn't collect them with great regularity. The name alone had a come-no-further quality, but time and a few influential believers have done their part to bestow historical significance on Suicide, some of those believers identifying in the group an early ancestor of the electronic music that would later rise to dominance. By the 21st century, somewhere out in Bushwick, it was a little cooler to say you were into Suicide. Of course, that's not when Bruce Springsteen got interested in the group, or where, or why. Suicide called themselves punk as early as 1970, a year after Woodstock and somewhere around Johnny Rotten's 14th birthday, well before the term's usage soared. The word was printed in their flyers. But come 1976 and 1977, when punk emerged as a phenomenon, Suicide didn't look like punk, if only because they lacked some of the genre's defining features, such as a drummer and a guitar player. They weren't like the Ramones or the Clash, Elvis Costello and the Attractions, or Blondie. There was a classification dilemma, based in part on all that was missing. It was two men, one doing things with a microphone, the other playing electronic instruments, early synthesizers, and drum machines, among other things. No matter that Suicide was on bills with the Ramones and every other act among those mentioned above, they would need every kindness history had to offer before they were welcomed into the punk category or seen as fathers of electronic music. They shared stages not just with those referenced, but also with the New York Dolls, Richard Hell, Talking Heads, and others. But not infrequently, they were asked to get off those stages. Alan Vega described having to block a door to keep people in the room during a performance. Rolling Stone's review of Suicide's debut called it puerile. The Village Voice described it as meaningless, a con. Even at the time of Vega's death in 2016, the New York Times obituary, written by John Pareles, referred to Suicide as being as much a provocation as a concert act. More telling, Pareles marked that Suicide's music would later be more widely tolerated. Tolerated. Not the word you'd expect in a musician's New York Times obituary. A YouTube clip captures a moment during a Suicide opening set when an arena full of Cars fans got its act together enough to shout in unison, "Fuck you, fuck you, fuck you." All of which meant that Bruce Springsteen, after meeting Alan Vega in the power station's hallways, was sometimes traveling in a pack of one when singing Suicide's praises. We first met Springsteen in 1980, remembers Vega in the New York Post. He was recording The River, and we were recording our second album in New York. I spent 5 or 6 days hanging out with him and driving around. Then we had a playback meeting for our album. There were 3 or 4 big shots from our label, and Bruce was there too. After we played the album, there was deathly silence, except for Bruce, who said, "That was fucking great." Suicide, Springsteen told me, there was something in it that called to me. This very dangerous music that spoke to some part of you that music didn't always get to. It was quite influential on Nebraska, just the tone of it, I would say. There was an unforgivingness in it that appealed to me and that I wanted as part of my own music. Vega looked to the 1950s, to early rock and roll, as an inspiration. But Suicide was anything but a nostalgia act. Early Elvis, Little Richard, Johnny Cash, Vega told one interviewer, trying to explain what music mattered to him most. They represented that lonely man on the lonely street in the middle of a lonely nowhere. They're singing, they're doing their thing, it's a loner thing. Unlike many of the critics who reviewed Suicide over the years, Springsteen detected this thread of influence in the music. "I've liked Suicide for a long time," he told Mojo. "If Elvis came back from the dead, I think he would sound like Alan Vega." Among the Suicide recordings that Springsteen would reference over the years is Frankie Teardrop. In a 1984 Rolling Stone interview with Kurt Loder, Springsteen described it as one of the most amazing records I think I ever heard. One critic describes that same recording as a 10-minute horror drone. As it opens, Frankie Teardrop recalls a scene with which Springsteen himself is associated, that of a young working-class man arriving home from a factory job to wife and baby. But from there, it devolves into something much darker, murder, infanticide. Alan Vega's screams, signifying the baby's death by shooting, are about as troubling as anything you'll hear on record. The recording was the centerpiece of Suicide's 1977 debut. The unforgiving aspect was, of course, in both the recording sound and the story told. If Vega was inspired by the 1950s, it was a 1950s of madness, of violence, a shadow world that lay far, far from Pat Boone's house. As clearly as anything else, Springsteen's connection with Vega during the recording of The River marks the beginning of Nebraska's emergence. Off-putting to many, Suicide was a powerful example of recorded music's wildest possibilities. Yeah, I guess Alan Vega was more of a performance artist than a singer-songwriter, Springsteen told me, and we share that interest in early rock and roll. The 60s is a whole different ball of wax. The fundamental nature of the roots of where I come from is pre-60s, the E Street Band itself. After 64, we're not that influenced by psychedelia and all that kind of music. We're kind of rooted in blue-collar 1950s aesthetic. I was always sort of just a circumstantial hippie. The few years that I lived that lifestyle, it was just I got thrust into it by life. But I connected with Alan on a musical level, among other things. Suicide's recordings whispered in Springsteen's ear, telling him there was a world of music, much of it unmapped, that extended well beyond the realm of the songs that often decided popular music's character. Love, celebration, romance, and all its vicissitudes, these were popular music's common themes, and much of it was wrapped in a melodic allure and danceable rhythms. Suicide said that music had some other places it could go. As Springsteen labored to finish The River, reconceptualized as a double album, Suicide got his interest. They weren't a band, not really. They were a collaboration, a duo, closer to art rock than to rock and roll. They didn't sound like any of the references Springsteen had thrown out over the years, but they stuck with Springsteen like a thing growing inside him as he tended to other business. When it got to the point at which Springsteen had some 80 songs recorded for The River, he had to learn again how to stop. Finishing, that would remain Springsteen's challenge over the years. He could always write more, change the sequence, switch songs out, redo the artwork. To complete an album is to choose an arbitrary point at which to stop working, nothing more, and Springsteen didn't like making that choice because after that, he didn't have any choices. They finally took the master tapes out to Chuck Plotkin's Clover Studios in LA to mix the double album. As Springsteen says in the moment they got there, we did not know how to mix what we'd recorded. Jimmy Iovine came by the studio with Tom Petty as a friend and a trusted insider. Iovine worked both as a second engineer and as an engineer on earlier Springsteen projects, but was now a producer working with Petty, Stevie Nicks, Bob Seger, and others. Iovine listened to what they'd done and couldn't find a better way to question what he felt were the Rivers' confused musical priorities than to ask, in his own wry fashion, when they were going to record the lead vocals. For his part, and in a style different from Iovine's, Petty told Bruce that he wanted to know what the words were, that he was invested. Some would say that when you can't understand what the singer's saying on a Bruce Springsteen record, you may want to rethink your mix. But they would finish the album with angst and doubt walking beside Springsteen the whole way. The record would come out on October 17, 1980, 14 days after the start of a tour that would extend almost a year. Within less than a month after its release, The River was Springsteen's first #1 album. By November 15th, Hungry Heart was at number 5 on the Hot 100, his first top 10 single. It was Springsteen's most broad-based success to date. The tour would be remembered as one of the E Street Band's greatest and as the tour that cracked Europe. The River Tour was more than just a career high point, though. It was also the experience that found Springsteen exploring more deeply his unique standing as a public figure. So many earlier experiences of success, such as that of finding himself on the covers of Time and Newsweek simultaneously, were like things that happened to him. The best he could do in those situations was react. He downplayed the hype, ran from it, cursed it. But the success that came with The River was his own doing, something he himself shaped. Rather than react to it, he began thinking more and more what he could do with it. Bruce Springsteen never studied the music industry how-to book in order to cultivate the E Street culture that grew up around him. His inner circle of bandmates and collaborators was a result of an almost natural growth, guided by Springsteen's instinct. No one really trained for the jobs they were doing. The manager, Jon Landau, was a writer and critic who became a producer. Then he found himself acting as Springsteen's manager, in part because no one else was doing the job, but also because it seemed as if he and Springsteen could have the necessary conversations that would foster Springsteen's growth. The E Street Band was a club act that learned how to be a recording band. This was how Springsteen wanted it. Describing the team he built up around himself, Springsteen explained his reasoning to me. I was not interested in professionals. They like schedules. They like somebody who's going to approach their work as a piece of work and not very obsessively. I was into crafting an identity that was very, very personal to me as a man, as an artist. That was the job that I was doing and needed to do, for myself, for my own inner life. So I needed people who innately understood that that was what we were crafting. I wanted to connect that identity with the very big picture of the country at large. And so I had big ideas, and I had no problem spending all my time trying to bring them to fruition. So I needed people who were going to be willing to go in as deep as I needed and was willing to go myself. Generally, those are not professionals, just people who were passionate and had some skills. As an approach, Springsteen's is counterintuitive. Expertise, experience, a track record, these are the things artists are encouraged to look for when assembling a team. Not Springsteen, he went on. John had managerial skills, and he could learn to be a manager. Charlie Plotkin had enough skills to mix Darkness on the Edge of Town. As far as I know, I'm not sure if he mixed any other records in his life, but he mixed that one quite well. But I've done that with a lot of people over the years, said, hey man, just plug it in, and if it sounds okay coming back, we're good. These are people who are not carrying around any ideas about the way something must be made. They're about process. They're not invested in a particular process. I needed people who were not invested in that way. I knew this intuitively, because I was just a kid when John came on. I was my son's age. I was just flying by the seat of my pants. Jon Landau knows the ship he came in on. Me, Chuck, some others among us, we started doing things that we didn't normally do, he told me. I didn't want to be a manager. I wanted to be like Holland Dozier Holland. I liked the art. The managers were the bad guys. Your resume wasn't going to dictate the job in Bruce Springsteen's world. Springsteen got himself a manager who wasn't a manager, and together they went on a voyage of discovery. Springsteen once described Landau as the Clark to my Lewis, two men bound in exploration. Lewis Springsteen the captain, Clark Landau his chosen co-leader. Thomas Jefferson gave Meriwether Lewis the gig leading the Corps of Discovery, and Lewis approached William Clark. Some 50 men joined them on their journey to explore the West, many getting venereal disease along the way. Maybe Springsteen's analogy is even better than at first it seemed. But it all meant that the exploration would continue, because it was in the nature of what Springsteen had put together. Roles could shift, key players could suddenly do something they hadn't trained for, a roadie could engineer, and what applied to the others also applied to Springsteen. He would shift positions, consider what else he could be, keep digging to find what was down there. Chapter 5, Following the River. Odysseus has become a stranger in his own land. Daniel Mendelsohn, An Odyssey. Perhaps the coincidence of the river tour's earliest dates and Ronald Reagan's November 4th, 1980 electoral win demanded from Springsteen some kind of conscious reconsideration of what he should be and do as a public figure himself. The day after Reagan's win from a stage in Arizona, Springsteen said it plainly. I don't know what you guys think about what happened last night, but I think it's pretty frightening. Reagan, on the campaign trail just months before that victory, was asked if an actor could be president. Without hesitation, he replied, "How can a president not be an actor?" The 1980s were going to be a time of color and costume, of theater and pageant. The recession of the early 1980s was, of course, the gray and unmoving world that was reality for most Americans. The place out behind the showy sets that Reagan erected in his charismatic visioning exercises. Springsteen was thinking more and more openly about who he was in relation to all that. Another actor? Then, a month or so after Reagan's electoral victory and some 2 months into the River Tour, on December 8th, Mark David Chapman shot John Lennon outside New York City's Dakota Building where Lennon lived. The world needed more than a rock and roll party, and Springsteen knew it. Crush on You could provide an escape, but the question became one of whether escape alone was what that moment was calling for. What else could music do? From the stage and in the interviews conducted during the tour, Springsteen spoke more and more of what he was thinking about, what he was reading. He talked about Joe Klein's Woody Guthrie biography, Howard Zinn's A People's History of the United States, a book called The Pocket History of the United States. Picking up a copy of Ron Kovich's Born on the 4th of July between tour dates, he found himself considering an America quite different from what Reagan portrayed in his Let's Make America Great Again campaign. More than he ever had, Springsteen was contemplating the role of the entertainer. If Reagan's America was a false construction, what truths did it conceal? And who should fight to expose all that was hidden from view? It was an old question that returned when history demanded it be so. Should the people on stage extend their roles? Nebraska would unearth images of an America more complicated than any Springsteen had thus far envisioned. But the process started with the questions Springsteen was asking himself on the River Tour. Not everyone wanted their favorite musicians to drag politics into the venue, and that included members of the E Street audience. Was there a way to do it that stopped short of saying, "Vote yes on Prop 10"? It was a line Springsteen wanted to understand, so he was looking out there, finding out just who bought those tickets. What were they there for? He knew it was something more than dancing. On an off night in St. Louis, Springsteen went to the movies alone. Woody Allen's Stardust Memories was showing, a film that's become harder to watch with time, but even then it was uncomfortable. Allen is the lead, playing a filmmaker enough like the man himself the viewers assumed a connection between the two. Throughout the film, Allen is badgered by obnoxious, wildly caricatured fans who were after the filmmaker's autograph, validation, attention, time, scent, their grotesques. Before the film started that night in St. Louis, at the concession stand in the theater's lobby, a Springsteen fan named Steve Satanovsky, a knows-all-the-words kind of fan, spotted Springsteen standing there in the popcorn line, a rolled-up newspaper under his arm. Of course, neither Springsteen nor Satanovsky had seen the Woody Allen film. Satanovsky, as a fan, seized the moment. He went up to his favorite performer and asked the man to sit with him and his sister. Springsteen said yes. The musician sat between the siblings. Then it was Stardust Memories, the fan as Parasite. Well, shit. What was Satanovsky supposed to say then? So he asked Springsteen, the guy lodged between a fan and his sister, very directly, "Is it really that bad?" To which Springsteen said, "Nah, I don't feel like that so much." Jane Shapiro, a writer and former girlfriend of Satanovsky's, years later wrote a beautiful remembrance of Satanovsky in a piece titled "My Friend and Bruce Springsteen." She'd been invited to Stardust Memories that night, but had passed, a near miss. By the time of her writing in 2007, Satanovsky was dead from complications related to diabetes. He was in midlife when he died. She'd heard the story of Stardust Memories directly from Satanovsky and had read Springsteen's recollection of the night and musician. As Jane Shapiro heard the story from Satanovsky, after the movie, Springsteen asked to borrow change to call a cab, and Satanovsky offered to drive him back to his hotel. Springsteen accepted the offer. Then Satanovsky asked if maybe they could swing by the family home to meet the parents, which Springsteen agreed to. Satanovsky's mother, in a house dress, cut up some watermelon, apparently requesting a little proof that this was indeed Bruce Springsteen. The album cover wasn't enough. She checked his credit card. Yup, it was him. Before leaving, Springsteen gave the woman his mother's phone number, asking if she could call Adele and testify, mother to mother, as to the well-being of his son. Only Jane Shapiro's account includes a mention of the fact that Satanovsky, on the drive to his family's house, slipped a bootleg tape of one of Springsteen's concerts into his 8-track player and began to sing. He even asked Springsteen to join him on one song's chorus. For Shapiro, who had watched her friend Steve track Springsteen from Greetings from Asbury Park forward, this was the best part of the story. It's also a fitting example of what happens when an artist, over a period of years, forges with his fans the kind of intimacy Springsteen had. One would have to guess that Springsteen did his part in the sing-along. Many artists at Springsteen's level wouldn't have gotten in the car, and if they had, surely they would have found a way out of it when the chorus hit. But Springsteen stayed in the car to find out more about the people to whom he'd been singing for so many years. When Springsteen got off the River Tour, with roughly a year of road work completed, he went with most of the band and much of the crew to Clarence Clemons' Hawaii wedding. There he acted as best man. It was as much an end-of-tour party as it was a nuptial ceremony. Steven Van Zandt was not in attendance. That summer, EMI had approached Van Zandt about a solo deal, and as Dave Marsh recalls, the guitar player got to work as soon as the tour ended. Steve was Bruce's oldest friend, Marsh writes, but he was every bit as brash as his buddy was cautious. Burning up with the idea of an album of his own, he set to work on it without waiting for a contract to be signed, which meant without a company to foot the bills for studio time. In the months ahead, Van Zandt and Springsteen would work together as producers on a second album for Gary U.S. Bonds, but the urgency and focus Van Zandt brought to his own solo work was no doubt a message impossible to miss. While Van Zandt was the only E Street musician to work his way onto Springsteen's production team, it was becoming clear that he had ambitions beyond that and unrelated to his life in the E Street Band. And why not? But like any band watching one of its core members launch a solo career, the E Street Band was surely feeling the shift. Unlike Van Zandt, Springsteen didn't come home with a need or a burning desire to capitalize on what the River had already made possible. There was no rush to the process of becoming whatever it was Bruce Springsteen was meant to be next. Of course, the two men were in very different situations. Van Zandt was crafting and preparing to launch a solo career. Springsteen was an established band leader about to stumble inadvertently into his own version of that same thing. The River, as a tour and as an album, was a success to contend with. It made its statement. The rock and roll band and the rock and roll show, as things and sounds and meaningful social constructions, weren't ready to sit behind glass at the Smithsonian. Not yet. Springsteen's audiences had voiced their position, so nothing would have made more sense than to go back at it. But something was stopping Springsteen. Even he didn't know exactly what it was. He grasped that with the European leg at the River Tour, something had shifted. A greater frontier had opened. The game had gotten bigger, spreading across the globe. And he knew that a hit single and a number one album had left a mark. It was a situation to build on, not linger on. The deeper feeling, however, was one of unease, and unease that had little to do with bands. Because Springsteen's story so often looks like a dream come true, the record company Rosie just gave me a big advance. It's sometimes hard to fathom the trouble he felt when things went according to plan. When I asked him about that moment, the sense of arrival that came with the river, he said this: I knew that something had happened to me that hadn't happened to anyone else I knew. I was a guy that when I first made a record, I didn't know anyone else who'd made a record. I'd never met another recording artist. I was totally on my own turf, having my own experience. The main thing that did happen to me when I came off the river is that I was solvent, which would make me unique in my little neighborhood. And that was where I still lived. So I was dealing with that, with all my very conflicted feelings about being so separate from the people that I'd grown up around and that I wrote about. I was trying to figure out how I was going to deal with that, and it was with a lot of guilt for a long time. Home from Hawaii, Springsteen took his unease back to the Colts Neck rental he'd moved into during the year of the River Tour. He got the place after being forced to leave the Holmdel, New Jersey farmhouse where he'd written Darkness on the Edge of Town and The River. As Peter Ames Carlin writes, when Bruce moved from Holmdel to a rented ranch house on the edge of a reservoir in Colts Neck, an ex-urban area 10 minutes east of Freehold, his then-girlfriend Joyce Heiser helped him to furnish the place by cruising the neighborhoods around Monmouth County on garbage day in search of cast-off chairs and tables. He'd had a #1 album and a top 10 single, but if you threw out a chair in Colts Neck, New Jersey in 1981, there was a chance it might end up in Bruce Springsteen's living room. It wasn't that Springsteen hadn't experienced money, but he was a guy unaccustomed to seeing it go into his bank account and remain there. Some big checks had been in his hands, but they always seemed just to be passing through, on their way to someone else's wallet. That included the check for $800,000 made out to Bruce Springsteen from CBS Records, a check that had him saying, "I'm a millionaire," knowing full well he wasn't. He understood, without question, that by late that day, all $800,000 would be used to buy his former manager, Mike Appel, out of the contract that kept Springsteen bound to the man. And really, it might have been easier for Springsteen to see the money go elsewhere. Then it could be someone else's problem. His discomfort with the trappings of success was no act, more a symptom of his disconnection from his own experiences, past and present. Springsteen started the River Tour with a total of $20,000 to his name. That wasn't boat money, horse money, or even car money. It was rent money. By the time the tour ended in Cincinnati, however, things were somewhat different. Somewhat. He was able to reward himself with his first ever new car, a Camaro Z28. That was about it. And even the Z28 was more an object of shame than it was a symbol of victory. I felt as conspicuous as if I were driving a solid gold Rolls Royce, he'd write in his memoir. I sat around in anguish over whether I should spend $10,000 on a new car, he recalled. I was 31 and I'd never owned a new car in my life. For that matter, outside of studio expenses, I'd never spent $10,000 on myself. I didn't know anyone who was making more than they could live on. The Camaro was less an experience of celebration than something to manage, and the passenger seat was empty. The moorings for rock and rollers, if somewhat juvenile, were pretty straightforward. What band are you in, and who's your girlfriend? Joyce Heiser had helped Springsteen move in, had in fact been his girlfriend since 1978, but the relationship was over by the end of the River Tour, and she all but evaporated from the story. As she told Carlin, his whole thing in those days was, when I want to see you, you need to be here, and when I don't, you need to be gone. Now it was a deeper kind of gone. Dave Marsh's definitive biography makes one mention of Heiser, spelling her name Heiser, and giving her a bit part in an anecdote about Robin Williams. No girlfriend, the band scattered, alone. That was Springsteen's predicament in the fall of 1981. Though one crew member had described Springsteen's life during the writing of Darkness on the Edge of Town several years earlier as his loner period, people have said the same of other times in Springsteen's life, but none of those loner periods were as pronounced as the months following the River Tour. It was definitely a closing to a certain earlier section in my life, Springsteen told Carlin. the initial section of the traveling and touring and those early records. He was back to being a full-time loner, writes Dave Marsh, adding that now the loner was beginning to experience his condition in a different way, as nothing more than loneliness. Sitting with him in 2021, I asked him about that moment, about that house that was not a home. Warren Zanes, thinking of the Homedale farmhouse you were in before that, where you worked on Darkness, the river. There the band was the family. So your experience coming off the river tour is, well, you hadn't come home to a house that empty in a while. Springsteen, right, and that's what I did. Warren Zanes, and you were coming out of a relationship. Springsteen, yes, that's right. I was really on my own. The house I had been in, the big farmhouse, was a very inclusive space, a big rambling old farmhouse. And I sort of did an emergency landing coming out of the river, got thrown out of that farmhouse and ended up renting a ranch house, which was not much of a house at all, but I made the record there. At night, he'd drive the solid gold Camaro to Freehold, going to see the homes where he'd lived with his grandparents and parents. He never got out of the car. It was what he describes as a pathetic and quasi-religious compulsion. My car was my sealed time capsule, he explains in Born to Run, from whose bucket seats I could experience the little town that had its crushing boot on my neck in whatever mental time, space, or moment I chose. Come evening, I rolled through its streets, listening for the voices of my father, my mother, me as a child. No sound of a crowd, just ghosts and anxious murmurs. From that point forward, Springsteen would never again be in a band the way he'd been in one for the river. He was not someone's boyfriend, didn't even belong in his own neighborhood. He was alone and in Nebraska. He kind of went into seclusion, Max Weinberg, drummer in the E Street Band, recalled to Brian Hyatt. He didn't see a lot of him, and for a while, none of us even knew where he lived. I remember that distinctly.